There was a guy named Olin Hendricks. I was reading about something that happened in his life. He had always wanted to be a missionary, and he really had a heart for the continent of Africa. He wanted to go there and serve as a missionary. He had taken some short-term trips there, and every time he came back, he said, that's what I want to do. I want to go back there full-time and give my life to mission work there. But his wife was not eager at all to be a missionary. She really had no desire whatsoever to do that kind of work. In fact, her idea of roughing it would be to stay at a hotel that didn't have room service. So he had a hard time trying to get her to even consider. But finally, he got her to go on a trip to the continent of Africa. He had lined up a tour there. He was hoping that maybe if he got her there and she got to see the beautiful country and the beautiful people, that she would change her mind and she would say, yes, I want to do this with you. And so he took her on the trip, and at every stop, everywhere they went, nothing but griping and complaining from her the whole time. Finally, he kept saying, well, just wait till the last few days because we're going to go to Victoria Falls. Now, Victoria Falls in the continent of Africa has some of the greatest scenery in the whole continent. And he thought maybe if I get her there, she could see how beautiful that is. It might change her mind. So they went to Victoria Falls, and there they were standing on the banks, and there's a statue on the banks there at Victoria Falls. And it's a statue of a missionary named David Livingstone, who's a great missionary. And he had given his life there in serving Christ. And there's the statue of him there on the banks, and it's like he's gazing out over the land as if he's looking for the next horizons that he was going to go out for Christ and be a witness in those areas that God would lead him to. Now, as they stood there pondering that statue quietly for a few minutes, he finally asked his wife, what do you imagine that David Livingstone is thinking about? And she said, I think he's thinking, I've had it up to here with Africa. Did not quite have the effect that he wanted it to have by taking her there. So here's my question for you today. Have you ever reached a point with something in your life where you've just had it up to here? Or maybe up to here? And up to here on me is only up to here on a lot of you, so that's all right. Right? Have you ever reached a place with maybe your marriage or your job or your schooling or some part of your life, raising your kids and the struggles that you've got with that, whatever it is, where you just feel like I have just had it up to here? Now, when you reach that point, it robs you of your joy, doesn't it? It robs you of the enthusiasm of what you're doing. It robs you of the ability to really be excited about your life when you reach those places of great discouragement. And I think we've all had times like that where there's been this heavy discouragement that robs us of being able to move forward with faith and anticipation of what God has in store for us. And I think the danger there is when we get really discouraged is not only does it keep us from doing the things we need to do with the attitude we need to have, but it can lead us to turn our backs on God eventually. When you face discouragement over and over again, whether it's something that's self-inflicted or something that happens to you the way it did in Joseph's life, it could cause you to just kind of give up on everything, including your faith, your commitment to God. That's why the Bible urges us not to grow weary in doing good, because it reminds us in due season you'll reap a harvest if you don't give up. He wants us to know to hang in there, because if we don't give up, there will be that reward, that harvest that he's talking about. But boy, it's hard to see that when you're really discouraged, isn't it? It's hard to hold on till we get to that place. But it's essential that we persevere if we want to enjoy the harvest that God wants to produce in our lives and in the world and the work of the kingdom today. So I want us to look at this again today at the story of the life of Joseph. We've been in this series now. This is the 4th week. You can go back and look at our website if you missed any of these and get caught up on what you might have missed. But today we're picking up, especially we're going to be focusing on Genesis chapter 40. We're going to pick up with a little bit of a lead-in from chapter 39. But I want to remind you a little bit of the life of Joseph and why, by all human standards, he had every right to be discouraged. I mean, for a good part of his life was like a roller coaster. It was up and down. I mean, he starts out as his dad's favorite son, all right? Good start, right? His dad loves him, and he wants nothing but the best for him, and he's giving him all the best that can be given. He's got a nice home. He's got a well-to-do parents, and he seems to have a lot going for him, and he's likable, and he's talented. Lots of good things there. But he had brothers that were very jealous of him, and the fact that his dad made no bones about him being the favorite. And they were so jealous and resentful that they saw an opportunity to beat him up, and they were going to kill him, and they decided at the last minute, no, let's not do that. Let's sell him to this passing caravan that was coming through, and we could get some money out of this. So they sold him and then faked his death with the dad, and the dad was grieving about the loss of his son. And Joseph is going from one moment being dad's favorite boy to in shackles as a slave. That quickly his life turned around. And in slavery, like at any point in time when we've had slavery, they brutalized the slaves. They did not treat them well at all. And Joseph, no doubt, went through some of those things. In fact, in the book of Psalms, Psalm 105, verse 18, it says that they bruised Joseph's feet with shackles, and his neck was put in irons. That's how slaves were treated. And when he was first sold into slavery, that's the kind of treatment he was having. You couldn't get much lower than he was at that point. Now, he had to be thinking, we probably would have been thinking, God, what in the world are you up to? Have you just forgotten about me? Have you turned your back on me? Have you forsaken me in some way? I mean, I wasn't doing anything wrong. I wasn't being disobedient to you, and then I end up like this. Is this how you reward the righteous, God? Is this how we get treated when we're trying to honor you in our lives? I mean, he could have wanted to reject other people too, because he thought for a while he could trust people. But in these first 30 years of his life, he finds out that people will let him down over and over again that he thought weren't going to let him down. And he could have said, all right, I'm never going to be nice to people anymore, and I'm not going to trust people anymore. I'm going to put up this wall and this shell around me where I don't ever let anybody in anymore. I mean, that's how a lot of us respond when things like that happen to us and we get discouraged along the way. You would have thought if you'd visited Joseph while he was in prison that you would have found a totally dejected person. I mean, even as a slave, he tried to do the right thing. And then he was working for Potiphar. And you remember Mrs. Potiphar, if you were here last week? Mrs. Potiphar didn't do him right and falsely accused him, and he ended up being put in prison. And even in prison, he tried to do the right thing. And even in prison, he had somebody that he thought was going to help him out, and he ends up not helping him out anyway. You would think if you visited him in prison, you would have found somebody totally dejected, totally bitter, totally angry, and that's not what you find at all. You find someone still trying to honor God, still trying to do what was right and be used by God, even in that situation. Boy, I think we can learn a lot from Joseph. So today, let's spend some time, first of all, looking at the evidences we have for Joseph's remarkable faithfulness in conditions where all of us, any one of us, would have been totally discouraged by what was going on. Let's look at the first evidence. Joseph maintained a sense of responsibility even in the middle of these circumstances. In chapter 39, it says, when he was Potiphar's slave, the Lord was with him, and Potiphar made him an overseer of the house. With Joseph in charge, Potiphar did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate, remember? And then it goes on in chapter 39 and verse 20. It says he's in prison now, and it says, Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So Joseph had been the model slave, and that didn't work out well, and now he's determined to be the model prisoner. He thinks that that's what he should be doing even under those conditions. He wanted to be one of those individuals that had that ability to bounce back even from these blows that he kept getting in his life. These hard things, when you thought things were going to get better, all of a sudden they got worse again. You been there? You think things are starting to look a little better, and then bam, something else comes up, something that knocks you down again, just when you thought you were getting on your feet. If you live long enough on this earth, you're going to get some of that. Some of these kids, even at a young age, you think, that somebody's your friend, and then they don't treat you like a friend, or you think you've got an opportunity to make the team, and then you don't get to play. And there's just so many things that happen in our lives that can keep knocking us down, aren't there? We live in a world where we face those things over and over again. Joseph was trying to take this on and process it and still be responsible to God to handle this in the best way that he possibly could. He remained a person who was responsible. With the responsibilities that he had, he took care of them even when he got knocked down. That's one of the hardest things when you're discouraged, is just to keep moving forward, taking care of your responsibilities that you need to be taking care of. Joseph set a great example for us there, didn't he? The second evidence is Joseph remained sensitive to other people even while he was going through all kinds of problems himself. Let's pick up in verse 40 now, verse 1 of chapter 40, verse 1. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in the custody, the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. Now, you've got two people here that are in prison, and they are put in the prison where Joseph is. We don't know exactly what happened here, but we've got the baker that worked for Pharaoh, and we've got the cupbearer that worked for Pharaoh. The baker would have been the one who prepared the food for him. The cupbearer would have been the one who tasted the wine before he drank it. Sometimes he tasted all the food, but especially the wine that he would drink to make sure. And that day and time, oftentimes the way they would try to overthrow a government was they would try to poison the food of the leader. And so they had these people that they put in these responsible positions that they felt like would protect the leader by making sure everything was okay, putting themselves at risk in order to do that. Now, we don't know exactly what happened here. It could be that they missed it one time and they didn't catch it, and the Pharaoh had gotten sick and almost died. We don't know the history here. It could have just been that the baker decided to put him on a health food diet or something. We don't know for sure exactly what was going on. But we know that he got mad at them, and it was such a thing that he put them in prison here, the same prison where Joseph was. Then God arranged for them to be introduced to Joseph while they were there. Look at verses 4 and 5. After they'd been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now, the dreams that they experienced here are more than just kind of like sometimes we have a bad dream after we ate pizza too late that night or something. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a dream that they saw was very vivid and seemed very real, and it seemed to be trying to communicate something special to them that they needed to hear or know about. God often spoke in those days through visions and dreams, and he brought these dreams to these two while they were in prison. They were so vivid, they were etched in their mind, and they were spinning around in their mind trying to figure out what did these things really mean. They didn't know how to figure out the meaning behind what had been revealed to them. It says in verse 6 and 7, when Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" Now, isn't this impressive? Think about this. Joseph is 28 years old. He's in prison himself. He's had all these bad things happen in his own life. And still, when he's walking around the prison there and he's taking care of the other prisoners, he notices that two of them are really struggling, that they're really worried about something, that something's really bothering them. How many times do we get so wrapped up in our own trouble that we're not paying attention at all to the people around us? Noticing that other people might be having some problems. They might be struggling too. And we're not concerned about that at all, because after all, we got problems ourselves, right? We got problems. So why would we be noticing anybody else? Why should we be paying attention to them? We got to deal with our own stuff, right? But he says, "Why are you so down in the dumps today? What's the problem?" What's going on in your life? Now, he could have been having a pity party for himself, but instead, he's sensitive to the needs of others. And I think that's great evidence to his faithfulness, even while he's going through these circumstances, that he didn't let his discouragement keep him from being sensitive to other people. Well, there's a third evidence here, too, and that is that he maintained a consistent testimony for God, even while he was going through these struggles. Verse 8, it says they both said to him, "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." So they're admitting, we don't know what these dreams mean, and we don't know who does. We don't know how to get an answer to this. We don't know how to get this figured out. Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." Now, Joseph did not say, "Hey, no big deal. I can interpret dreams. In fact, God gave me some special dreams. He showed me how my brothers are going to bow down to me and worship me. And He showed me how my parents even were going to bow down and honor me. And I was going to rule over all of them." And he didn't even go into any of that at all, did he? Who did he point him to that could give them the answers? God. He said, God's the one who can give you the answers to these puzzles, these struggles that you're having here. He pointed them to the fact that God was the source that was the help they needed to go to. So he didn't say, just tell them to me, let me take care of this. He said, God's the one who does this. He's the one that can have interpretations that are right and accurate and true. So he's saying, you can tell them to me because I will go to God with these things. And He's the one that will be able to have the answers for you. He gave glory, he gave credit to God. He didn't try to get it for himself. Sometimes, even when we do notice people struggling and we try to step in and help out, we do it in such a way that we make sure we're the ones getting the credit, getting the glory, getting the honor for doing it, don't we? Instead of making sure we point people to God. That's why we like to do so many things when we try to help people in the name of God and His church. We try to do it in the name of the Lord's body, the Lord's church, so that people know it is the real source of the help that they're getting is God Himself. It's not individuals here. God's working through individuals here, but it's God that's providing the help that people are getting. It's God that's being faithful and being the provider. And Joseph wanted to make sure that God got the credit here. Well, there's a fourth area of evidence for his faithfulness, and that is Joseph's evident spirituality that was still there even in prison. It says in verse 9 and following, "So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, 'In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand.' This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer." So we see that Joseph had maintained that relationship with God even in prison, so that God was still able to use him and work through him. He kept his spiritual life intact, in order, even under those conditions. When I say his spirituality was evident, I mean that he maintained that spiritual walk with God, that connection with God, where God could still work through him and His Spirit could still give to him and reveal to him the interpretation of these dreams. He was in a relationship with God where God could still use him, even while he was in prison. And sometimes in our discouragement, we break off that relationship with God. We don't maintain it like we need to. We don't stay in prayer like we need to. We don't stay in the Word like we need to. And we excuse ourselves because things aren't going well after all. I mean, if God was doing what He ought to do, I'd be faithful, but He's not. So I don't see the need to do this now. And we let it slide when we're going through those struggles. And Joseph evidently had maintained that relationship with God in such a way that God was still going to be able to use him under these conditions. Well, there's a fifth area of evidence, and that's Joseph's integrity and authenticity that he maintained there. He told the truth about how he felt. Look at verse 14, 15. He interpreted that dream for him, and then he said, "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness, mention me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. Joseph didn't try to fake it. He was being honest about how he ended up there and about how he had not done anything wrong that put him in that place, but he was still there anyway. He wasn't trying to have false piety by saying, oh, I know that I'm in prison, but it's okay. Everything's fine. It's all good. Right? Joseph didn't say this is all good. And we, followers of Christ, don't have to act like everything's good all the time. They're real problems. They're real struggles. We mess up or other people mess up and we suffer negative consequences and we get discouraged. And God wants us to be real and honest with Him about those things. Not try to fake it. Not try to act like everything's okay even when it's not. And that's hard for us because our pride gets in the way and we want everybody to think we, got it all together and everything's good in our lives. We all try to make a good impression, or at least most of us try to make a good impression on other people. And when you're trying to do that, sometimes it's hard to be totally honest and truthful about the struggles. And even with God, much less with other people, sometimes it's hard to be really honest about the struggles. And I think we all battle that a little bit. It's the human condition. It's the human nature to want to give the impression that everything's okay. Sometimes even when there's real problem, real struggle going on in our lives. So he didn't say, oh, I'm perfectly happy in prison. No, that's not what he said. He said, I really don't want to be here. I don't like being here. So if you could put in a good word for me to the Pharaoh, please do that. Maybe when you get released and you're in good favor with him again, you could put in a good word for me and let him know how I helped you out and how I interpreted this dream for you. And that'll help me maybe be able to get an early release or something. You could get me released from where I am here. Now, he wasn't just honest about that. He was also honest in another way with the other dream that he interpreted. Look at verse 16 and 17. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation. All right, so he heard the first interpretation. And he thought, well, that turned out well. That was good news. So I'm going to ask him to give me my interpretation. Maybe it's going to be good news for me too, right? So he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. And the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. Now, Joseph instantly knew what that dream meant. He knew that the baker was going to be held responsible and he was going to be executed. Now, if you were Joseph, what would you have said to this guy when he asked, now, what does my dream mean? Now, he's expecting something good, isn't he? Because he just told the other guy a good result from his dream. We'd be really tempted not to tell him exactly what the dream meant, wouldn't we? We'd be really tempted to try to put some kind of spin on this. To say, well, this dream's a little more difficult to interpret. I'm going to need a few days to work on this. But in the meantime, don't buy any long-term life insurance or anything, all right? Don't make any long-term investments here or decisions for a while. But he didn't do that. As tempting as it was not to break the bad news, he knew that he needed to be truthful with him about this. It's hard sometimes to do that, isn't it? There was a wealthy woman who hired an author to write a biography of her family. He discovered that one of her grandfathers had been executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing, the prison. He wanted to write the truth in a way that would not embarrass the family. So he wrote in her biography, her grandfather occupied a chair of great power in one of America's most noted institutions. He was very much attached to his position even until his death. We're really tempted, aren't we, when we have bad news for somebody not to tell it. But let me encourage you in one area in particular that I have to deal with a lot as a pastor, and that is if someone has been diagnosed in your family or friends with terminal diagnosis and you know it and the doctor knows it and it's been revealed to you, one of the things families try to do sometimes is kind of hide that from the person and protect the person from that news. And I know God is a miracle worker. I know he can turn that around, but unless God chooses to do that, this is a terminal thing. When you know that, I think you do people a disservice when you don't just deal with it in truth and honesty, because you rob them of the opportunity to redeem what time they have in the best way that they possibly can. Because when you know for sure there's limited time, it can really get you focused, and you can really handle and deal with some things the way you need to before you go from this world. You can get everything in order like you need to when you know that you need to do that. I appreciate now in the medical field, more and more doctors are just doing that. They're just being more forthright and upfront with this news and telling people. Now, sometimes people don't like it, and they say, he didn't have very good bedside manner. Friends, there's no good way to tell this guy the interpretation of his dream. 3 days from now, you're going to be impaled. You're going to be executed. There's no nice way, no easy way to tell somebody that. And there's no way to do that with some kind of news with terminal illness or something like that either. You want to do it in love. You want to do it as tenderly as you can. But people need to know news like that. So Joseph was saying to this guy, you've got about 3 days. You need to get your life in order, because that's all the time you got. This is not going to turn out well. Well, there's another evidence of Joseph's faithfulness, and that's evidence number 6. That is Joseph's tenacity. I like that word tenacity, that stick-to-itiveness that we need to have. That's one of the characteristics about Joseph that is most impressive, that faithfulness that he had, that tenacity, where setback after setback, he kept going, he kept working hard, he kept trying to do the best that he could. Go to verse 20. Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in the interpretation. In other words, he was executed, just like Joseph had said he was going to be. But now look at verse 23. The chief cupbearer, the one he gave the good news to, is restored to his position. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Wow. I mean, Joseph didn't think for sure that if he went to Pharaoh on his behalf, it would get him out. But he thought, might be a chance here. I mean, it's the only hope I've got right now that I know about. I don't know whether any other way I'm going to get out of this. But maybe if this guy that I helped goes and speaks on my behalf, maybe that'll get me a release here from prison. But the guy just forgot about him. Didn't do anything, didn't even try to help him. I mean, once everything was better for him, once things were going well for him, that was it. He just moved on. Didn't remember Joseph at all. Isn't it amazing how quickly we can remember an offense and how quickly we can forget a favor? We are all a little bit like that, aren't we? And that's what happened. The cupbearer went on like Joseph had not helped him at all. He got back to Pharaoh's palace, and he forgot Joseph in prison. And in chapter 41, in verse 1, it begins this way. When two full years had passed. So for 2 years after the guy got back, he never brought Joseph up at all. He never spoke up for him. He never tried to help him out. Now, Joseph was in that prison for 2 long years. That would be hard for anybody. You'd think that would be the straw, maybe that would break the camel's back, so to speak. Setback after setback, and now one more setback. The guy didn't remember him. The guy didn't help him. And for 2 years, he's stuck in that prison. Now, keep in mind that Joseph did not know the rest of the story like we do. There was not a Gideon Bible in the prison where he could flip over to chapter 41 and see that 2 years later he was going to become Pharaoh's right-hand man. He didn't have that insight. He didn't have that ability to know that in advance. But in spite of all these reasons for discouragement, Joseph held on. He kept working hard. He kept trying to do what he thought God would want him to do, even under those circumstances. And apparently, it seems obvious looking back on it, knowing the whole story, that God was using even those 2 years to get him ready for the next thing that God was going to do in his life. The big thing, the thing that was going to impact the world in such a powerful way. Joseph could not have seen that in those 2 years in prison, but God was still at work during those 2 years. Joseph was learning more of the Egyptian culture. He was learning more of how to endure hardship. He was learning more about how to have compassion on others. God was working on him through those 2 years of suffering to get him ready for the big things that were about to happen, where Joseph was going to be used by God to bless the whole world through a time of famine and great need, where they were going to be able to be ready and prepared for it and bless even his own people that he had been away from all of that time. God was still working even in the prison. And in our discouragement that we're facing in our lives, whether it's right now or in the days ahead, it's hard to see and remember that God is still working, isn't it? It's hard to remember when you can't feel it at the moment that God has not left you. He has not forsaken you. His love is still true and real, and He will still be there even when you don't see it at the time. He hasn't forgotten you. I love Paul Harvey and all the stories that he would tell. How many of you remember Paul Harvey? I just love his voice was just so comforting and reassuring too, the way he told the stories that he told. And he had this definition of success that I really liked. He said this: a successful person is a person who gets back up one more time than he falls down. I like that. A successful person is just a person who gets up one more time than the number of times he gets knocked down. If you just don't give up, if you just keep going, if you just hold on one more day, God's at work behind the scenes, even when you don't see it. And He's not forgotten. And He keeps His promises. It's not always in our time, but He does what He promises He's going to do. That's why Paul said in 2 Corinthians 4, verses 8 and 9, we are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. That was Paul's life, and that was Joseph's life too. And that can be our life if we don't give up, if we hold on, if we keep going even when we get knocked down. Whether it's our own fault or somebody else's, if we just keep going, get back on track, get back with that relationship with God that we need to have. Hold on to that. Don't let go of it. God will be there, and He will be the faithful God that He promises that He will be. So before we go today, I want to close with 3 lessons that we learned from Joseph's example that all of us need to remember, all of us need to hear. Lesson number 1 is this: when you're discouraged, keep performing your duty anyway. Just keep doing what you're supposed to be doing, even when you're discouraged. Are you a husband? Just keep being the husband that you need to be. Keep working on that. Keep trying to be the better husband. Your wife, try to be the best wife you can be. Are you a parent? Oh, parents, it's a hard job. You could get discouraged so many times as a parent trying to parent your children. Just keep going. Keep doing what you're supposed to do as a parent. Don't give up. Don't quit. At your job, and you don't think things are going well at work, and you don't think it's being handled the right way, you don't think you're being treated fairly, well, keep doing your job. Don't act like that's an excuse not to do your job and do it well. Keep doing it anyway. Keep going. Performing those duties that you're supposed to be performing. Believe it or not, occasionally, even pastors get discouraged. Even once in a while, on Sunday morning, when that alarm goes off, I'm very tempted to pull up the covers and just say, I'm sleeping in today. That doesn't happen often, but once in a while, even on Sunday morning, I think, I've got an associate. I call up Mike Scherer and say, you got a sermon in your back pocket? Go with it, man, you know? Yeah. But I go ahead and get up, and I get ready, and I come. And I think, well, today, in order to get through it, I'm just going to look at them the way they look back at me. Some people sit out there saying, just try to get through to me today. You know, give it your best shot, buddy. Yeah. No. Here's what happens when I just keep going. Something will happen because I showed up and I did what I was supposed to do. And somebody will give a hug or a word of encouragement or appreciation, or somebody will say later on, send me an email. I've gotten some encouraging emails over the years where they just said, I appreciate that message. It really helped me at a particular time where I needed to hear that. And I didn't know that was going on in their lives, but the Holy Spirit did. God did. And when you just keep acting in obedience, God will still keep using that obedience, right, in the right ways. And occasionally I'll say something in the sermon that surprises me. And I think, man, that was pretty good. And it encourages me that God said that through me. I appreciate that God could still use me just because I was being obedient, right? And He wants that from you too. Just be obedient. Just keep going. Don't quit. William James once said this: if you act the way you wish you felt, you'll eventually feel the way you act. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I really do. You keep going. We can't control our feelings, but we can control our behavior, can't we? We can decide how we're going to act, what we're going to do. And that's exactly what Joseph was willing to do and what we need to learn to do too. We need to keep going forward, being obedient, doing what God wants us to do. Remember Galatians 6:9. Don't become weary doing good, for at the proper time you'll reap a harvest if you don't give up. Lesson number 2, when you're discouraged, look for somebody else to encourage. Joseph found 2 other prisoners that he tried to reach out to. One of them he was able to really help. The other one, not so much, right? But he tried. He was concerned about them. He was trying to help them out. He wanted to be a person that others would be benefiting from having contact with and having that interaction with. He wanted to be that kind of person. And that's what we need to try to be, even when we are discouraged ourselves. We sometimes will think, I'm in no shape to help anybody else because I'm going through all this. Well, maybe the best thing you could do is get your mind off yourself for a little bit and look for somebody else that you could be of some help to. Dr. William Steigen wrote this about his life. He said he was suffering from severe depression years ago, and a wise counselor told him to find somebody else to encourage. So Steigen forced himself to sit down and write a thank you note to a teacher he had back in school who taught him a love for literature. He wrote a thank you note just saying this: thank you that you taught me to appreciate poetry and prose. A few days later, he received a return note that read like this: Dear Willie, when I read your letter, I was blinded with tears, for I remember you as a little fellow in class, and it warmed my old heart. I've taught school for 50 years, and yours is the first letter of thanks I've ever received from a student. I shall cherish it until the day that I die. Steigen was so moved by that return note that he remembered somebody else that he needed to thank, and he wrote another note of encouragement. Within a few days, he had written 500 notes of encouragement and gratitude, and it completely healed his discouraged spirit just going through that process. You feel a little discouraged today? Let me ask you to do something. If you really want to get better, now some people don't. You want to wallow in self-pity. Some people really like wallowing in self-pity. But if you don't want to keep doing that, then let me encourage you to encourage somebody else today. To try to pick somebody else up. To try to give them some joy that they would not have had except that they had contact with you today in some way. 2 Corinthians 1, beginning with verse 3. It's a good reminder. I use it at funerals a lot. It says, Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all of our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. You know, when God gives you comfort and encouragement, you know what? One of the purposes behind it is not just to make you feel better. There's another purpose behind it. He wants you to take that and use it to comfort some other people and encourage some other people. It's not just for you. It's to go through you to some other people around you. He wants the blessing to go forward from you to others. So when you're looking for God to bring that comfort to you, look for opportunities at the same time to comfort other people, to encourage other people in that process. Well, there's a third lesson I want us to leave with today, and that's this. When you're discouraged, put your trust totally in God. That's the most important lesson of all of these. Put your trust totally in God. Joseph did. He believed somehow God was going to work even through this next setback too, and somehow bring some good out of it. He just trusted that God was still at work, that God was still going to keep the fulfillment of the dreams that he had allowed Joseph to have when he was a boy. That somehow that was still going to be, and he didn't know how this was going to happen. As a prisoner there in Egypt, he didn't know how this was going to turn out, but he just felt like he could trust God even then. I think that's a great test of our commitment, isn't it? Do we still trust God when everything falls apart? When it's not going at all like we thought it would? When it's harder than we ever believed it was going to be? Friends, there's some things you can't change. There's some times when you just have to say, you know what? I've done everything I can do, and I can't fix this. And that can be discouraging until you remember, but it's in God's hands. And he can handle this. He's bigger than this. He's more powerful than I am in every way, and he has me in his hands. I love what the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews 12 and verse 11. It's a hard reminder, but it's a good one. He says, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who've been trained by it. So here's my question. Will we allow the discipline of the discouraging times we go through, we will allow those to accomplish what God wants to accomplish in our lives? You see, he's wanting to work on us through those times. He's wanting to grow us up through those times. He's wanting our faith to get stronger. He's wanting us to hold on and display faithfulness even during those times. Because he can use those things to mold us more into the image of his Son, Jesus Christ. I mean, that should be the goal of every Christ follower, right? To grow up to be like Jesus. Can you imagine how discouraging it was for Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane when he prays there, face on the ground before the Father, sweat like drops of blood pouring from his forehead. Father, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. He didn't want to have to go through the cross. He knew his friend had already betrayed him. He knew another friend was going to deny him. He knew all of his disciples were going to run and hide and not be there for him. How discouraging would that be? But he went on to say, but not my will, Father. I want your will to be done. I'm going to be obedient because I know you're going to use this. I know you're going to use this for some good if I will faithfully walk through these things that I have to go through right now. He did that for you, and he did that for me. I love the words of the psalmist in Psalm 30 and verse 5. Weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. You want to have that promise in your life? It's not found just in saying, oh, it's all good. No, it's not all good. There's going to be weeping. There's going to be struggle. The only way good comes out of that is when you give it to God. You give your whole life to him, good and the bad, the celebrations and the struggles. You give all of that to him. And only God can take all of that and bring forth the joy that comes in the morning. He wants to give you that in your life. If you want to receive that from him, you come to him. You give him your life today. As we stand and sing, we invite you to come.